Welcome, Lynn, to Views and Reviews. I'm awfully glad to have you on the program today. We've known each other for quite a few years now. We first met, of course, with Ray Straight's group that met in the old wheelhouse, and you had not.
We met in a bar, Jim. Just go ahead and say
That's
it.
right. We met in a bar, our weekly meetings, and even my wife approved. So the Ray Straight, who kind of for a while was kind of a mentor to us, and it was his writing group that we met. And that dates back to about 2008, maybe before that, maybe 2007, because we published the first issue of Straight Jackets in 2008, and you were in that first issue. So it must have been
Big year. What a big year. Wow.
Yeah.
That was a big year.
Well, okay, let's get right on into the questions here.
Okay.
What made you want to become a writer?
Oh my gosh, I'm not very unique in this sense. I hear a lot of authors say that they wanted to write since they were little kids, and that's really my deal, ever since I was a little child. And in fact, it was kind of fun because recently I was visiting with a friend. I'm still friends with Kathy from high school. So we met when we were 17. And she says, I still remember you wanting to write so badly. So I can say that I have a witness that I've wanted to write all my life.
That's really interesting. When you first came to our group, you had not had a book published at that time.
No, my first book was published in 2012. So given the dates that you were just giving, it was a while.
And your first book was Dakota Blues. And how many books have you had published since Dakota, including Dakota Blues?
This is my 9th. It's the proof copy, so it has that little band across it, but it's Opposites Attract in Sedona. And I have of late gone into what I call silver romance, Silver, because all of my characters are older than what is typically done in romance. But yeah, that's my 9th book, and I published it June 15th.
So in reality, you're almost turning out a book a year, not quite, but pretty close.
It's accelerating. My goal is to write more quickly. I have so many ideas, and I just want to get them out there. I have so much fun writing these stories, but I'm not a very fast writer. Last year, I did 2 books. It took me, my first book, Dakota Blues, which I published in 2012, took me about 8 years to write. The second one took about 4 years, and I've been steadily picking up the pace since then. My goal is to write at least 2 books a year.
That's interesting. I know that my wife, who had on earlier, it took her 5 years to write her memoirs.
Yeah.
So it takes a while. That first book, it really takes a while to not only to write, but to polish.
Well, you're learning so much. For me, it was like a master's degree in, literature or something. It was just, you're learning so much, and you throw so much away that, you have to start over a few times.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about, I think Hemingway said it best about, well, the writer needs a built-in crap detector, and we need to be able to see what is good and bad, and we have to be, I think, willing to cut even lines we love.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and with your first book, Dakota Blues, you seem to have developed a theme that has remained consistent throughout all your books and your short stories. Mm-hmm. How did you arrive at this? How did you come about this particular idea? And what is it? Let's see, you want to explain that first.
I would say that my theme is empowerment in the second half of life, becoming stronger. It offends me that our culture is so youth oriented. I mean, youth are great, don't get me wrong, but I think we devalue older people so much, and what we have to offer is not in the way we look or the way that our bodies are. I mean, young people are so beautiful, and God love them, but our beauty is on the inside. And I've learned so much about how the brain matures and how many strengths we have after the age of 50 that are just astonishing and impressive. And So it pissed me off that we weren't valuing older people. And I thought, with all the things that we have going on in our lives, man, we can take a punch. When life deals us those body blows, man, we just keep going, and we're so impressive. So I wanted to write about that. I wanted actually, Jim, I wanted to read about that more than anything. I wanted to read about people in the second half of life who were, doing a great job, and how did they do it? I wanted to know what was their secret, what was their trick. But I didn't want to read nonfiction so much, although I read anything. I wanted to read stories, and so thus the love of writing stories about people over 50 was born. And so that's a continuing theme, is empowerment in the second half of life, I would say.
I forgot what writer has said it. It seems to me maybe Toni Morrison or Maya Angelou, I can't remember which, but one of them said, if there's a story that you want to write and you can't find, you want to read but you can't find it, then write it.
Yeah.
So,
you know what? It's so exciting, though. I have to sorry to interrupt you, but this thrills me. I am seeing that there is more interest in this kind of writing. On my Twitter banner, I say, I want to know what happens 30 years after the young lovebirds walk off hand in hand into the sunset. What happens 30 years later? After they've raised the kids and everything else, what are they doing now? Now they're 50. They've got another 30, maybe 40 years, the way longevity is going in the United States. What do they do with that second half? So that is really my theme, is, what happens after the happy ever after?
yeah, it's really interesting. It's that whole idea of stories anyway, that stories, when they end in a novel or a short story, they don't end ever happily ever after. They simply end, and there's more to go. We don't know what it is. And there are great, as I think you've pointed out, there are great stories for down the road that, and you certainly have created your share that are really terrific books. Okay, let's take a look at one of, say, a book, perhaps the latest that you pointed out here. Take it from idea, where you got the idea from, through the marketing. How do you handle this?
I tend to get my ideas from a funny place. You know this about me already, but for those who are watching, I read a lot of advice columns, and I love questions about older people, or even younger people too. But advice columnists come up with some of the greatest scenarios, and I just wonder, well, what would happen with this person? Like I read an advice column about a person who was concerned about their friend who was selling their house and planned to live in a Holiday Inn or go on a cruise and live in a cruise ship or something like that. And of course, I wrote a short story, 30 pages long, about that. And I love just kind of getting my ideas from there. I never run out. I have a whole folder of ideas. And in fact, one of the things you were just talking about was, what happens with, like we were talking about, what happens with older people, people when they get older after the happy ever after. One of the ideas that I've had is to do fan fiction. So if a Jodi Picoult story ends, for example, or when I read a book by a noteworthy author with a high profile, and I think, man, that's really good. What happens next? I would just be thrilled to write a couple of short stories, maybe, telling about what happened with their main characters. So anyway, that's where I get my ideas from. I have a ton of them. I am my own kind of writer. Not everybody writes like me. Some people need to keep it kind of loose. I'm very structured. Right now, I'm in the process of writing book 3 in my Sedona Silver romance series, and I'm outlining like crazy. I already have about 4,000 words worth of an outline, and that works for me because I just get so confused. I can't see the whole picture. I need to write it down and see it as an illustration on a whiteboard or on a Google Doc or a table or something like that. So I outline in very great detail. I know I start with story structure. What are the tent poles? What's going to be the inciting incident? What'll be the midpoint? What'll be the dark night of the soul and the grand awakening and possibly a grand gesture, although that's becoming kind of cliched. Um, the point is, I structure things very clearly and then I outline. And then I write the book. And I try to push myself to do that quickly. NaNoWriMo has been, National Novel Writing Month has been a real big help to me because it has taught me to write in a more disciplined way. I keep a notebook saying what I'm going to do a month at a time, what challenges I have coming up in the month, what days will be good for writing. And so that by the end of the month, I hope to have what Anne Lamott called a shitty first draft. So I'm hoping to have, my bad first draft at the end of 30 days. But that's only possible because I outline. And then I let it sit for a little while. And then I go back and look at it again. After I get done writing the draft and it's as polished as I can make it, I have a new step that I'm going to do. Before I give it to my beta readers or my editor, I'm going to read the entire book out loud as if I were creating an audiobook. I know that reading out loud is always touted as a good way to find your errors and hear how the melody flows through your story. But I hadn't done that for the whole book. And that's caused me some time loss. So that's my process. I get the book all polished up I'm going to get the book as polished up as I can, then send it to my editor, and then send it to my beta readers. Then I make all the changes and publish it on KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, which is very, very helpful. I don't traditionally publish my books because that field has become increasingly consolidated. And now it's very difficult to get published, and I don't have that kind of time. I'm 69 years old, and I don't want to wait, 2 years to find an agent and another 2 years to see if they can market it. No, I need to produce more quickly than that. My goal is to write 20 books before I get to the point where I burn out or don't want to do it anymore or can't or whatever. So I hope that that's a quick overview, but that's pretty much my process.
It's interesting about how you structure the book so closely before you write it. I know a lot of writers do that. I tend to be structure a little bit and then let it kind of fill in as I go along. Herman Melville just simply sit down and wrote what he felt like that day, and but there are other writers like Willa Cather who were far more disciplined and would plan out their books as you're talking about. I
Jim,
think
I have to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have that knowledge in your head. You just have structure in your head. You know how to write, when to deliver the punch, where the high points are supposed to be. I call them the tent poles because when I see them, I see a circus tent kind of. You know all of that stuff. But when I've taught people how to do NaNoWriMo and how to outline quickly, I have become humbled by the fact that it doesn't work for everyone. That depending on how you are internally, it can kill your spirit to be too organized. So it just depends on how a person is.
exactly.
Again, sorry to interrupt, but I had to say
No.
you've always been my idol as far as writing a good story. But I think it's because you are so educated and also so knowledgeable. You just have it in your head, in your soul, how to put together a good story.
Actually, Spielberg and I did the same thing. We based our writing on the old time serials, where the chapter ends and there's a high point at the chapter. Now, in a straight novel, you can still do it that way as long as it's as long as it's not somebody heroine hanging off a cliff or building blowing up, but it's still a high point in some ways. Emotional high point, emotional trauma or danger, and so I always tend to do it. My create chapters that end on some kind of cliffhanger, not
I know you do.
something like that. Yeah.
You
But
do.
that,
It always frustrated us in our critique group because you'd end a chapter and we'd be thinking, darn it, what happens next?
yeah, well, I appreciate that. It's like I said, Spielberg and I both got our training from old time movie serials, um, and Edgar Rice Burroughs of all things, because that's the way he structured his books. And he was maybe the first author I've ever seen to do that. And I read a lot of him as a kid. Okay, let's see. My next question is very personal, because I want you to tell me, what do you think you've learned about writing and about yourself through the books that you published? Because I think writing is, to me at least, is a constant learning process. Not only the writing, but we learn so much about ourselves as we write. So, for you, what have you learned about writing, and what about it yourself?
I remember when I used to come to your critique group in the early days, and I would write in too minimal of a way. And you would say, you need to be more effusive, you need to expand that thought. And I didn't want to. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be that emotional. I didn't want to lay things out. And I learned to settle into a scene and to give people emotional gratification in the way that I wrote. But before with that, when I first started, I felt like I had to break new ground and be unusual and clever. And so I wrote in a minimalist style, but it really was like eating dry cereal. You know, you really need the milk and the sugar and the berries and everything else to make it taste good. And so I learned to trust that I could tell a good story and stop being so worried about feeling cliched. People like to see a story happen in a certain way. Since our ancestors, I mean, storytelling is an important part of being human, and there's a certain rhythm and a pattern to it. And if you ignore those rhythms and patterns because you think you're too freaking sophisticated or too cool for that, that you're going to break new ground and create a new style of reading or writing, good luck, you know. So I had to kind of learn to dial myself back and to be more, what it felt to me like I was being more cliched and you know, predictable or something like that. I didn't want to be. But once I backed off and started over again and realized I had to do a better job of telling a story, it became more fun for me. So that was one of the things I had to learn. And another thing that I've learned is that writing is a business. If you're going to make money, make it a success, you really have to have the discipline to do the writing and the advertising and everything else that goes into the writing business. You have to not just say, well, I'll get to that. No, you sit yourself down and you work. And even if you don't feel like it, or it's not a particularly good day for you, or you don't have that much time, I have become much more disciplined. And so I had a career that lasted 30 years before I did this. And it's becoming more and more every day like a job. But I say that in a good way because I like working. So that's another thing that I've learned.
I think that's one of the things that most writers don't realize, beginning writers, that it's a job. You sit down every day at certain times, you write, whether you
Mm-hmm.
feel like it or not. I mean, you don't wait for inspiration. You wait for inspiration, you could be sitting around for 3-4 months and not write a line. So
Yeah.
you have to find that ability to sit down and look at that blank page and start filling it in.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it too, of course. You write, and your first draft is there's a lot of extra stuff that just needs to be cut out, changed, revamped. But you get that first draft down, and you have something to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my next question is: do writers often come to you for advice, and if so, what advice do you give them?
You know, lately I have been asked quite frequently, by by people who I come in contact with. One of them, my chiropractor, was saying that she had a lot of good information about holistic health, and she wanted to be able to put it into a book and sell it for very little or hand it out to her customers or her clients, her patients, for their well-being and for her feeling like she was doing something good. But then I've also had other people come up to me and say that they want to write fiction. Whatever they write, my first question is always, what is your goal? Because if you want to write for fun, then there's one answer, one pathway. If you want to write for as a business to create an income stream, there's another pathway. And they take different levels of effort, different levels of intensity. So my first question is always, what do you want to do? And it's fun because I like talking about the planning. I like asking them, what is your goal? How do you see that happening? Do you want to make money, or do you just want to see your name in lights? So anyway, that's what's been happening lately. Strangely enough, a lot of people have asked me that question, about a half dozen in the last couple of months. One of my mentors says that she has an email that she has put together, and she'll get their email address and she just sends them the email because it's like a question that she answers so frequently that, instead of standing there talking and making it up off the top of her head, she just sends them the email.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. One thing I do think all writers want, it doesn't matter what their ultimate goal is, but what they really want is to be read. And to me, that's the number one priority for any writer. Do you want to be read? And then there's that secondary goal. And to me, that's the goals that you're talking about, whether it's just to write for fun or to try and be a bestseller or whatever the case is. Mm-hmm. But all writers ultimately want to be read. And so there, to me, that's the number one. I figure that all of them want that at least. My one last question for you is, are there any last thoughts about writing or books in general you'd like to make any comments on? Any last thoughts?
I am excited about, well, two things. One is that I'm excited about the fact that the market seems to be shifting and changing, especially in romance, away from just having romance focused primarily on young people who are starting their lives, who maybe choose to get married and have children, and they're just beginning, to the people who have already gone through that 30-year stretch and now have another 30 years in which to, thrive. The market is changing. There's even a category now on Amazon called later in life romance. And I'm gratified by that. I really am. So we'll see what happens. I have personally put together, I like to read everything, but when I come across a book that features older people, and I don't mean like flashes back and tells us what they were like as kids, but rather has a main character dealing with the issues of their present circumstances, their present second half of life existence. If it's good and I can recommend it, I've put together a collection on my website, which is anyshinything.com. And the page is called Midlife Fiction by Other Authors. And I don't include my own in that, but I have about 65 different books that I've gathered that I can recommend that deal with main characters who are older. The other thing that I'd like to say is kind of a spiritual point. Years and years ago, before I finished my final draft of Dakota Blues, I had an editor read it. And we were talking about the process wherein you're sitting at the keyboard and all of a sudden the story starts to flow. It's as if your fingertips are connecting with something else, bypassing your whole brain, and you're just a receiver for something. I said to her, when that happens, it almost feels like it's spiritual. It's something other than myself. Do you ever feel that way? And she looked at me in shock, and because she's a writer too, she looked at me in shock and said, if I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't write. It was like a communion, like a spiritual practice almost to write, to feel that creativity flowing through you. Probably what we're doing is we're tapping into our memories, but it's such a moving experience to come out of that and look around in your office and think, what day is this? Where was I supposed to be somewhere? Is it morning or is it evening? You know, you just get so lost in the beauty of the craft and the art.
And
Regardless,
your own story too. In other
yeah,
words, those characters become real, and
they sure do. Oh
yeah,
my gosh, they sure do.
yeah, and you get involved in your own characters and your own story, and it's almost like you're part of it, an observer. But
Mhm.
yeah, just a final word for me about you. When you first came to the group and joined us, the Ray Straight's group, when we were meeting in the wheelhouse, there were all of about 6 or 7 of us tops. And I thought the first time you read, I thought, well, this is very good, But what I've seen happen over the years is not that you've turned it in good, but a very good, very excellent writer. And
Thank you.
there's been a real maturity in your writing over those years, and also when a maturity of thought. In other words, to me, your books have taken on a depth that's greater than the first. The first were good books, but your later ones have depth to them that they've taken on this new kind of depth to them. And I really have enjoyed them. Lynne, I want to thank you being with us today, and good luck with your new book, and looking forward to reading it. And goodbye, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jim. See you later.